Chapter 8 Alain Badiou, or the Violence of Subtraction. Materialism, democratic and dialectical. In his Logique des Mondes, Badiou provides a succinct definition of democratic materialism and its opposite, materialist dialectics. The axiom which condenses the first is, there is nothing but bodies and languages, to which materialist dialectics adds, with the exception of truths. This opposition is not so much the opposition of two ideologies or philosophies as the opposition between non-reflected presuppositions, beliefs, into which we are thrown insofar as we are immersed into our life world, and the reflexive attitude of thought proper which enables us to subtract ourselves from this immersion, to unplug ourselves, as Morpheus would have put it in The Matrix, a film much appreciated by Badiou, in which one also finds a precise account of the need, evoked by Badiou, to control oneself. When Morpheus explains to Neo the lot of ordinary people totally caught in, plugged into the Matrix, he says, everyone who is not unplugged is a potential agent. This is why Badiou's axiom of democratic materialism is his answer to the question of our spontaneous, non-reflexive ideological beliefs. What do I think when I am outside my own control? Or rather, what is my spontaneous belief? Furthermore, this opposition is immediately linked to what one once called the class struggle in philosophy, the orientation most identified by the names of Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Althusser. Let us recall Mao's succinct formulation. It is only when there is class struggle that there can be philosophy. The ruling class, whose ideas are those of the ruling ideas, is represented by a spontaneous ideology, while the dominant class has to fight its way through intense conceptual work, which is why, for Badiou, the key reference is here Plato, not the caricatural Plato, the anti-democratic philosopher of aristocratic reaction against Athenian democracy, but the Plato who was the first to clearly assert the field of rationality freed from inherited beliefs. After all the negative judgments of the phonologocentric character of Plato's criticism of writing, it is perhaps time to assert its positive, egalitarian democratic aspect. In the pre-democratic despotic state, writing was the monopoly of the ruling elite. Its character was sacred. So it is written was the ultimate seal of authority. The presupposed mysterious meaning of the written text was the object of belief par excellence. The aim of Plato's critique of writing was thus double: to deprive writing of its sacred character, and to assert the field of rationality freed from beliefs. In other words, to distinguish logos, the domain of dialectics, of rational reasoning, which admits no external authority, from mythos, traditional beliefs. The significance of Plato's criticism thus appears to remove from writing its sacred character. The way to truth is not writing but dialectics, i.e. the spoken word with its implication of two or rather three parties, the speaker, the listener, and the language they share. With his criticism, Plato, for the first time in man's history, distilled the notion of rationality as such, free from all mixture with belief. The further paradox here is that the notion of the pure self-present voice, represented, copied by writing, this ultimate support of the metaphysics of presence that is the object of Derrida's deconstruction, is itself a product of writing. When philosophers were attacking the Platonic primacy of speech over writing, they were criticizing a byproduct of phonetic writing. It is scarcely possible to imagine a philosophy such as Platonism emerging in an oral culture. It is equally difficult to imagine it in Sumeria. How could a world of bodiless forms be represented in pictograms? How could abstract entities be represented as the ultimate realities in a mode of writing that still recalled the realm of the senses? The point is not just that speech is always already affected, constituted by writing, and so on, but that speech becomes the metaphysical word, the ethereal, pure medium of self-affection, of spiritual self-presence, through abstract phonetic writing. Prior to phonetic writing, speech is perceived as a practice which is part of a complex material life world. It is phonetic writing that purifies it. The qualification I am tempted to add here is that perhaps one should nonetheless suspend Badiou's understandable reticence apropos dialectical materialism and invert the subject-predicate relationship between the two opposites, materialist democracy versus dialectical materialism. There is a more constrained anthropological version of this axiom. For democratic materialism, there is nothing but individuals and communities, to which materialist dialectics adds, insofar as there is a truth, a subject subtracts itself from all community and destroys all individuation. The passage from the 2 to the 3 is crucial here, and one should bear in mind all of its Platonic, properly metaphysical thrust in the direction of what, prima facie, cannot but appear as a proto-idealist gesture of asserting that material reality is not all that there is also another level of incorporeal truths. Along these lines, one is tempted to supplement Badiou in two ways. First, are not bodies and languages synonymous with being, its multiplicity and worlds? The 3 we are dealing with is thus the 3 of being, worlds, and truths. For democratic materialism, there is only the multiplicity of being, endlessly differentiated reality, and different worlds, linguistic universes, within which individuals and communities experience this reality. Is this not indeed our spontaneous ideology? There is an endlessly differentiated, complex reality which we, the individuals and communities embedded in it, always experience from a particular finite perspective of our historical world. What democratic materialism furiously rejects is the notion that there can be an infinite universal truth which cuts across the multitude of worlds. In politics, this means totalitarianism, which imposes its truth as universal. This is why one should reject, say, the Jacobins, who imposed their universal notions of equality and other truths on the plurality of French society, and thus necessarily ended in terror. This brings us to the second supplement. There is an even more narrow political version of the democratic materialist axiom. All that takes place in today's society is the dynamics of postmodern globalization and the conservative nostalgic, fundamentalist, old leftist, nationalist, religious reactions and resistances to it, to which, of course, materialist dialectics adds its proviso, with the exception of the radical emancipatory communist politics of truth. It is here that the materialist dialectic passage from the 2 to the 3 gains all its weight. The axiom of communist politics is not simply the dualist class struggle, but more precisely the third moment as the subtraction from the 2 of hegemonic politics. That is to say, the hegemonic ideological field imposes on us a field of ideological visibility with its own principal contradiction. Today it is the opposition of market freedom democracy and fundamentalist terrorist totalitarianism, Islamofascism, and so on. And the first thing we must do is to reject, to subtract from ourselves this opposition, to perceive it as a false opposition destined to obfuscate the true line of division. Lacan's formula for this redoubling is 1 + 1 + A. The official antagonism, the 2, is always supplemented by an indivisible remainder, which indicates its foreclosed dimension. In other terms, the true antagonism is always reflexive. It is the antagonism between the official antagonism and that which is foreclosed by it. This is why, in Lacan's mathematics, 1 + 1 = 3. Today, for example, the true antagonism is not between liberal multiculturalism and fundamentalism, but between the very field of their opposition and the excluded third, radical emancipatory politics. One is even tempted to link this threesome to 3 different mechanisms of keeping a social body together. Number 1, the traditional matrix of authority in which a community is established through sacrifice or is grounded in some primordial crime, so that it is guilt which keeps the members together and subordinates them to a leader. Number 2, the invisible hand of the market, namely a social field in which, by means of the cunning of reason, the very competition among individuals, each following his or her egotistic concerns, results in a mysterious equilibrium which works for the good of all. Number 3, the open political process of social cooperation, in which decisions are neither made by the supreme authority, nor are they the outcome of a blind mechanism, but are reached through the conscious interaction of individuals. And furthermore, do these three modes not form a kind of Levi-Straussian triangle? Both market liberalism and the properly democratic space of civil public action and planned social cooperation are modes of societal self-organization, as opposed to externally imposed authority. How do these three modes relate to the three sources of social authority: the authoritarian, the technocratic, the democratic? Technocratic authority relies on qualification. Those who know should exert authority, versus both authoritarian and democratic forms of authority, which lack qualifications. A king rules because he was born a king, not because of his qualities. In democracy, everyone has the right to a share of power, independently of what he or she is or is not able to do. On the other hand, both authoritarian and expert forms of authority are selective. Only those who are qualified to rule by their position or expertise should rule, versus democracy, in which everyone should rule. And lastly, both democracy and technocratic rule are in some sense egalitarian, in contrast to traditional authority, where the whole point is that it is important who is claiming what. The two triads obviously do not directly overlap, which is why one can argue that the triangle should be extended into a Grimacian semiotic square, since the third mode is itself split between democratic self-organization proper and state power imposed from above onto society, self-management versus bureaucracy. The two axes of the semiotic square are thus central authority, traditional authority, state power, versus self-organization from below, the market, self-management, and external organization, symbolic authority, the market, versus democratic organization, modern state power, self-management. This allows us also to approach in a new way Badiou's concept of the point, as the point of decision, as the moment at which the complexity of a situation is filtered through a binary disposition and thus reduced to a simple choice. All things considered, are we against or for? Should we attack or retreat? Support that proclamation or oppose it? And so on. With regard to the third moment as the subtraction from the two of hegemonic politics, one should always bear in mind that one of the basic operations of hegemonic ideology is to enforce a false point, to impose on us a false choice, as when, in the War on Terror, anyone who draws attention to the complexity and ambiguity of the situation is sooner or later interrupted by a brutal voice telling him, "Okay, enough of this muddle. We are in the middle of a difficult struggle in which the fate of our free world is at stake, so please make it clear where you really stand. Do you support freedom and democracy or not?" The obverse of this imposition of a false choice is, of course, the blurring of the true line of division. Here, Nazism is still unsurpassed with its designation of the Jewish enemy as the agent of the plutocratic Bolshevik plot. In this designation, the mechanism is almost laid bare. The true opposition, plutocrats versus Bolsheviks, that is, capitalists versus proletarians, is literally obliterated, blurred into one, and therein resides the function of the name Jew, to serve as the operator of this obliteration. The first task of emancipatory politics is therefore to distinguish between false and true points. False and true choices, that is. To bring back the third element whose obliteration sustains the false choice. As today, the false choice between liberal democracy or Islamofascism is sustained by the occlusion of radical secular emancipatory politics. So one should be clear here in rejecting the dangerous motto, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," which leads some to discover a progressive, anti-imperialist potential in fundamentalist Islamist movements. The ideological universe of movements such as Hezbollah is based on the blurring of distinctions between capitalist neo-imperialism and secular progressive emancipation. Within the space of Hezbollah, women's emancipation, gay rights, and so on, are nothing but the decadent moral aspect of Western imperialism. This, then, is where we stand today. The antagonism imposed on us by the space of the dominant ideology is the secondary antagonism between what Badiou calls reactive and obscure subjects, leading their struggle against the background of the obliterated event. What other responses to an event are possible? Instead of withdrawing from political engagement, one should remember the motto that behind every fascism, there is a failed revolution. This motto is worth remembering, especially today, when we face what some call Islamofascism. Again, the opposition of liberal democracy and religious fundamentalism is misleading. A third term is missing. Responses to the event. In one of the early novels about Hannibal Lecter, the claim that Hannibal's monstrosity is the result of unfortunate circumstances is rejected. Nothing happened to him. He happened. This is the most concise formula of the event in Badiou's sense, an emergence of the new which cannot be reduced to its causes or conditions. Or to quote the wise old saying with which one of the Gothic DVD games starts, each event is preceded by prophecy, but without the hero, there is no event. One can easily translate this obscure wisdom into Marxist terms. The general outlines of each revolutionary event can be foretold by social theorists. However, this event can only really take place if there is a revolutionary subject. Or, as Badiou might put it, only if there is a subject can an event occur within an evental site. Which is why, for Badiou, the different modes of subjectivity are simultaneously the modalities by which the subject relates to the event, echoing Kant's thesis that the conditions of our experience of the object are simultaneously the conditions of the object itself. Badiou celebrates four such responses: the faithful subject, the reactive subject, the obscure subject, resurrection. Perhaps this list should be complicated a little bit so that there are actually 6 responses. The responses to the Freud event were 1. Fidelity, Lacan. 2. Reactive normalization, reintegration into the predominant field, ego psychology, dynamic psychotherapy. 3. Outright denial, cognitivism. 4. Obscurantist mystification in a pseudo-event, Jung. 5. Total enforcement, Reich, Freudo-Marxism. 6. Resurrection of the message of the eternal Freud in various returns to Freud. The responses to a love event are 1. Fidelity, 2. Normalization, reintegration, marriage, 3. Outright rejection of the evental status, libertinage, the transformation of the event into sexual adventure, 4. Thoroughgoing rejection of sexual love, abstinence, 5. Obscurantist suicidal mortal passion, a la Tristan, 6. Resurrected love, re-encounter. The responses to the Marxism event are 1. Fidelity, communism, Leninism, 2. Reactive reintegration, social democracy, 3. Outright denial of the evental status, liberalism, Fourier, 4. Catastrophic total counterattack in the guise of a pseudo-event, fascism, 5. Total enforcement of the event, which ends up in an obscure disaster, Stalinism, Khmer Rouge, 6. Renewal of Marxism, Lenin, Mao. So how do 1 and 6 coexist in figures such as Lenin or Lacan? This brings us to a further hypothesis. An event is necessarily missed the first time, so that true fidelity is only possible in the form of resurrection, as a defense against revisionism. Freud did not recognize the true dimension of his discovery. It was only Lacan's return to Freud that allowed us to discern the core of the Freudian discovery. Or, as Stanley Cavell put it apropos the Hollywood comedies of remarriage, the only true marriage is the second marriage to the same person. This point was recently reiterated by Jacques-Alain Miller. One might believe that there is no heresy without orthodoxy, but one often observes that it is when discourses which will later be heretical emerge that the future orthodoxies come about, and that it is rather through an after-the-fact effect that orthodoxy takes hold. The point is not just that orthodoxy is the triumphant heresy, the one which succeeded in crushing all others, but a more complex one. When a new teaching, from Christianity to Marxism or psychoanalysis, emerges, there is first confusion, blindness about the true scope of its own act. Heresies are the attempts to clarify this confusion by retranslating the new teaching into the old coordinates, and it is only against this background that the core of the new teaching can be formulated. It is against this background of multiple responses to an event that Adrian Johnston recently discerned the ideologico-critical potential of the Badiouian topic of evental breaks, when the balance of an ideological situation is disturbed by the emergence of symptomal knots, elements which, while formally part of the situation, do not fit into it. The ideological defense mechanism can adopt two main strategies: false eventalization of the dynamics which remains thoroughly integrated into the existing situation, or disavowal of the signs which delineate true evental possibilities, their reading as minor accidents or external disturbances. 1. Making mere modifications appear to promise evental newness, a tactic that comes to the fore in the ideology of late capitalism, whose noisily marketed perpetual revolution is really just an instance of the cliché, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Or, as Badiou puts it, capitalism itself is the obsession of novelty and the perpetual renovation of forms. 2. Making the sites of sheltering potential explosive evental upheavals appear to be, at minimum, unremarkable features of the banal, everyday landscape, and, at most, nothing more than temporary, correctable glitches in the functioning of the established system. Perhaps this line of thought needs just one qualification. Johnston writes that the ideology of the worldly state, through a sort of bluff or masquerade, disguises its non-integrated weakest points, its Achilles' heels, as fully integrated cogs and components of its allegedly harmonious functioning, rather than as loci containing the potential to throw monkey wrenches in its gears and thereby generate evental dysfunctions of this regime, a regime that is never so deeply entrenched as it would like to appear to be in the eyes of its subjects. Is it not rather that one of the ideological strategies is to fully admit the threatening character of a dysfunction, and to treat it as an external intrusion, not as the necessary result of the system in a dynamic? The model is here, of course, the fascist notion of social antagonisms as the result of a foreign intruder, Jews, disturbing the organic totality of the social edifice. Recall, then, the difference between the standard capitalist and the Marxist notion of economic crisis. For the standard capitalist view, crises are temporary, correctable glitches in the functioning of the system, while from the Marxist perspective, they are its moment of truth, the exception which only allows us to grasp the functioning of the system, in the same way that for Freud, dreams and symptoms are not secondary malfunctionings of our psychic apparatus, but moments through which one can discern the repressed basic functioning of the psychic apparatus. No wonder that Johnston uses here the Deleuzian term minimal difference. A minimal, minuscule difference, here construed as the difference between the change category statuses simultaneously assigned to a single intra-situational multiple, both by the ideology of the state and, in opposition, by another non-statist framework. When we pass from the notion of crisis as occasional contingent malfunctioning of the system to the notion of crisis as the symptomal point at which the truth of the system becomes visible, we are talking about one and the same actual event. The difference is purely virtual. It does not concern any of its actual properties, but only the way this event is supplemented by the virtual tapestry of its ideological and notional background. Like Schumann's melody for piano first played with and then without the third line of notes written only for the eyes. Johnston is right here in critically noting Badiou's quick dismissal of apparently gradualist measures of seemingly minor political adjustments and reforms, i.e. not quite evental gestures, in the sphere of legislation and socioeconomics, while awaiting the quasi-divine intervention of the system-shattering evental rupture, ushering in an uncompromisingly perfect revolution. But the preceding analyses call into question whether he can be entirely confident and sure that what appears to be gradual or minor really is so, or rather, simply seems this way solely under the shadow of statist ideology's assignation of change category statuses. One cannot ever be sure in advance if what appears within the register and the space of visibility of the ruling ideology as minor measures will not set in motion a process that will lead to the radical, evental transformation of the whole field. There are situations in which a minimal measure of social reform can have much stronger large-scale consequences than self-professed radical changes, and this inherent incalculability to the factors involved in setting the pace of the cadence of socio-political change points towards the dimension of what Badiou tried to capture under the title of the materialist notion of grace. Johnston raises the following question: what if the pre-evental actors don't really know exactly what they're doing or quite where they're going? What if, under the influence of statist ideology, they anticipate that a particular gesture will effectuate a system-preserving modification, only to find out, after the fact of this gesture, that their intervention unexpectedly hastened, rather than delayed, the demise of this very system? Is not the first association that comes to mind here that of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, which, while aiming at minor improvements that would make the system more efficient, triggered the process of its total disintegration? These, then, are the two extremes between which political interventions have to find their way. The skila of minor reforms, which eventually lead to total collapse. Recall also the fear, justified we can say today, of Mao Zedong that even a minimal compromise to the market economy would open up the path that ends in total surrender to capitalism, and the Charybdis of radical changes, which in the long run merely fortify the system, Roosevelt's New Deal, and so forth. Among other things, this also opens up the question of how radical different forms of resistance are. What may appear as a radical critical stance or a subversive activity can in fact function as the system's inherent transgression, so that often a minor legal reform which merely aims at bringing the system in accordance with its professed ideological goals can be more subversive than open questioning of the system's basic presuppositions. These considerations enable us to define the art of a politics of minimal differences, to be able to identify and then focus on a minimal, ideological, legislative, and so on, measure which, prima facie, not only does not question the system's premises, but even seems to merely apply its own principles to its actual functioning, and thus render it more consistent with itself. However, a critico-ideological parallax view leads us to surmise that this minimal measure, while in no way disturbing the system's explicit mode of functioning, effectively moves underground, introduces a crack in its foundations. Today, more than ever, we effectively need what Johnston calls a pre-evental discipline of time. This other sort of temporal discipline would be neither the undisciplined impatience of hurriedly doing anything and everything to enact some ill-defined, poorly conceived notion of making things different, nor the quietist patience of either resigning oneself to the current state of affairs, drifting along interminably, and or awaiting the unpredictable arrival of a not-to-be actively precipitated X, sparking genuine change. Badiou's philosophy sometimes seems to be in danger of licensing a version of this latter mode of quietism. Those subjected to today's frenetic socio-economic forms of late capitalism are constantly at risk of succumbing to various forms of what one could refer to loosely as attention deficit disorder, that is, a frantic, thoughtless jumping from present to ever-new present. At the political level, such capitalist impatience must be countered with the discipline of what could be designated as a specifically communist patience, designated thus in line with Badiou's assertion that all authentic forms of politics are communist in the broad sense of being both emancipatory as well as generic, qua radically egalitarian and non-identitarian. Not the quietist patience condemned above, but instead the calm contemplation of the details of situations, states, and worlds, with an eye to the discerning of ideologically veiled weak points in the structural architecture of the statist system. Given the theoretical validity of assuming that these camouflaged Achilles' heels, as hidden eventual sites, can and do exist in one's worldly context, one should be patiently hopeful that one's apparently minor gestures, carried out under the guidance of a pre-evental surveillance of the situation in search of its concealed kernels of real transformation, might come to entail major repercussions for the state of the situation and/or transcendental regime of the world. There is, however, a limit to this strategy. If followed thoroughly, it ends up in a kind of active quietism. While forever postponing the big act, all one does is to engage in small interventions with the secret hope that somehow, inexplicably, by means of a magic leap from quantity to quality, they will lead to global radical change. This strategy has to be supplemented by the readiness and ability to discern the moment when the possibility of the big change is approaching, and at that point, to quickly alter the strategy, take the risk, and engage in total struggle. In other words, one should not forget that in politics, major repercussions do not come by themselves. True, one has to lay the groundwork for them by means of patient work, but one should also know to seize the moment when it arrives. The specifically communist form of patience is not just patient waiting for the moment when radical change will explode in a manner reminiscent of what systems theory calls an emergent property. It is also the patience of losing the battles in order to win the final fight. Recall again Mao's slogan, from defeat to the final victory. Or to put it in more Badiouian terms, the fact that the evental eruption functions as a break in time, introducing a totally different order of temporality, the temporality of the work of love, fidelity to the event, means that, from the perspective of non-evental time of historical evolution, there is never a right moment for the revolutionary event. The situation is never mature enough for a revolutionary act. The act is always, by definition, premature. Recall what truly deserves the title of the repetition of the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture. It was clearly ahead of its time, premature, and as such doomed to fail. Yet, precisely as such, it was perhaps even more of an event than the French Revolution itself. These past defeats accumulate the utopian energy which will explode in the final battle. Maturation is not waiting for objective circumstances to reach maturity, but the accumulation of defeats. Progressive liberals today often complain that they would like to join a revolution, a more radical emancipatory political movement, but no matter how desperately they search for it, they just do not see it. They do not see anywhere in the social space a political agent with the will and strength to seriously engage in such activity. While there is a moment of truth here, one should nonetheless also add that the very attitude of these liberals is in itself part of the problem. If one just waits to see a revolutionary movement, it will of course never arise, and one will never see it. What Hegel says about the curtain that separates appearances from true reality, behind the veil of appearance there is nothing, only what the subject who is searching has put there, holds also for a revolutionary process. Seeing and desire are here inextricably linked. In other words, revolutionary potential is not there to be discovered as an objective social fact. One sees it only insofar as one desires it, engages oneself in the movement. No wonder the Mensheviks and those who opposed Lenin's call for a revolutionary takeover in the summer of 1917 did not see the conditions for it as ripe and opposed it as premature. They simply did not want the revolution. Another version of this skeptical argument about seeing is that liberals claim that capitalism is today so global and all-encompassing that they cannot see any serious alternative to it, that they cannot imagine a feasible outside to it. The reply to this is that, insofar as this is true, they do not see tout court. The task is not to see the outside, but to see in the first place, to grasp the nature of contemporary capitalism. The Marxist wager is that when we see this, we see enough, including how to go beyond it. So our reply to the worried progressive liberals, eager to join the revolution, and just not seeing it having a chance anywhere should be like the answer to the proverbial ecologist worried about the prospect of catastrophe. Do not worry, the catastrophe will arrive. To complicate the image further, we often have an event which succeeds through the self-erasure of its evental dimension, as was the case with the Jacobins in the French Revolution. Once their necessary job was done, they were not only overthrown and liquidated, they were even retroactively deprived of their evental status, reduced to a historical accident, to a freakish abomination, to an avoidable excess of historical development. This theme was often evoked by Marx and Engels. How, once normal, pragmatic, utilitarian bourgeois daily life was consolidated, its own violent, heroic origins were disavowed. This possibility, not only the obvious possibility of an evental sequence reaching its end, but a much more unsettling possibility of an event disavowing itself, erasing its own traces, as the ultimate indication of its triumph, is not taken into account by Badiou. The possibility and ramifications of there being radical breaks and discontinuities that might, in part due to their own reverberations unfolding off into the future, become invisible to those living in realities founded on such eclipsed points of origin. Such a self-erasure of the event opens up the space for what, in the Benjaminian mode, one is tempted to call the leftist politics of melancholy. In a first approach, this term cannot but appear as an oxymoron. Is not a revolutionary orientation towards the future the very opposite of melancholic attachment to the past? What if, however, the future one should be faithful to is the future of the past itself? In other words, the emancipatory potential that was not realized due to the failure of the past attempts, and that for this reason continues to haunt us. In his ironic comments on the French Revolution, Marx opposes the revolutionary enthusiasm to the sobering effect of the morning after. The actual result of the sublime revolutionary explosion, of the event of freedom, equality, and brotherhood, is the miserable, utilitarian, egotistic universe of market calculation. And, incidentally, is not this gap even wider in the case of the October Revolution? However, one should not simplify Marx. His point is not the rather commonsensical insight into how the vulgar reality of commerce is the truth of the theatre of revolutionary enthusiasm. What it all really came down to. In the revolutionary explosion as an event, another utopian dimension shines through, the dimension of universal emancipation, which, precisely, is the excess betrayed by the market reality which takes over the day after. As such, this excess is not simply abolished, dismissed as irrelevant, but, as it were, transposed into a virtual state, continuing to haunt the emancipatory imaginary like a dream waiting to be realized. The excess of revolutionary enthusiasm over its own actual social base or substance is thus literally that of the future of, in, the past, a spectral event waiting for its proper embodiment. Most of the romantic liberal enthusiasts who first welcomed the French Revolution were appalled by the terror, the monstrosity unleashed by the revolution, and started to doubt its very rationale. The notable exception here is Shelley, who remained faithful to the revolution to the end, without idealizing it, without brushing terror under the carpet. In his poem, The Revolt of Islam, he formulated a rejection of the reactionary claim that the tragic and violent outcome was in some way the truth of the bright revolutionary hopes and ideals of universal freedom. For Shelley, history is a series of possible outcomes. Possibility has priority over actuality. There is a surplus in it beyond its actualization, the spark that persists underground, so that the very immediate failure of emancipatory attempts signals to those who harbor future revolutionary aspirations that they should be repeated more radically, more comprehensively. Perhaps the reason Badiou neglects this dimension is his all too crude opposition between repetition and the cut of the event, his dismissal of repetition as an obstacle to the rise of the new, ultimately as the death drive itself, the morbid attachment to some obscure jouissance which entraps the subject in the self-destructive vicious circle. In this sense, life, as the subjective category of fidelity to an event, keeps at a distance the conservation drive, the misnamed life instinct, as well as the mortifying drive, the death instinct. Life is what breaks with the drives. What Badiou misses here is the fact that the death drive is, paradoxically, the Freudian name for its very opposite, for the way immortality appears within psychoanalysis, for an uncanny excess of life, for an undead urge which persists beyond the biological cycle of life and death, of generation and corruption. As such, the death drive stands for the very antipode of the obscure tendency to self-annihilation or self-destruction, as is rendered clearly in the work of Wagner, whom Badiou admires so much. It is precisely the reference to Wagner which enables us to see how the Freudian death drive has nothing whatsoever to do with the craving for self-extermination, for a return to the inorganic absence of any life tension. The death drive does not reside in Wagner's hero's longing to die, to find peace in death. It is, on the contrary, the very obverse of dying, a name for the undead eternal life itself, for the horrible fate of being caught in the endless repetitive cycle of wandering around in guilt and pain. The final passing away of the Wagnerian hero, the death of the Dutchman, Wotan, Tristan, Amfortas, is therefore the moment of their liberation from the clutches of the death drive. Tristan, in Act 3, is not desperate because of his fear of dying. What makes him desperate is that, without Isolde, he cannot die, and is condemned to eternal longing. He anxiously awaits her arrival so as to be able to die. The prospect he dreads is not that of dying without Isolde, the standard complaint of a lover, but rather that of endless life without her. The ultimate lesson of psychoanalysis is that human life is never just life. Humans are not simply alive. They are possessed by the strange drive to enjoy life to excess, passionately attached to a surplus which sticks out and derails the ordinary run of things. This excess inscribes itself into the human body in the guise of a wound which makes the subject undead, depriving him of the capacity to die. Apart from Tristan's and Amfortas's wound, there is, of course, the wound, the one from Kafka's A Country Doctor. When this wound is healed, the hero can die in peace. This notion of the drive embodied in an organ also allows us to propose a correction to Badiou's notion of the body of a truth procedure. There are no bodies of truth. Truth has its organs, without bodies. In other words, a truth inscribes itself into a body through its autonomized organs. The child's wound in the lower chest in Kafka's Country Doctor is such an organ, part of the body yet sticking out of it, leading an immortal, undead life of its own, secreting blood all the time, yet, for that very reason, preventing the child from finding peace in death. It is at this point that one should turn to Deleuze against Badiou, to Deleuze's precise elaborations on repetition as the very form of the emergence of the new. Of course, Badiou is too refined a thinker not to perceive the evental dimension of repetition, when, in Logique des Mondes, he deploys the three subjective destinations of an event, faithful, reactive, obscure, he adds a fourth, that of resurrection. The subjective reactivation of an event whose traces were obliterated, repressed into the historico-ideological unconscious. Every faithful subject can thus reincorporate into its evental present a truth fragment which, in the old present, was pushed beneath the bar of occultation. This reincorporation is what we call resurrection. His beautifully developed example is that of Spartacus, erased from official history. His name was resurrected first by the Black Slaves' Rebellion in Haiti. The progressive governor Lavco called Toussaint Louverture Black Spartacus, and a century later by the two German Spartakists, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. What matters here, however, is that Badiou shirks from calling this resurrection repetition. Do we need a new world? Badiou's ambiguity with regard to this crucial point hinges on his triad, being, world, event, which functions in the same way as Kierkegaard's triad of the aesthetic, ethical, religious. The choice is always between two terms, and either or, that is, the three terms do not operate at the same ontological level. It is the same with Lacan's imaginary, I, symbolic, S, real, R, or with Freud's ego, superego, id. When we focus on one term, the other two get condensed into one, under the hegemony of one of them. If we focus on the imaginary, the real and the symbolic get contracted into the imaginary's opposite, under the domination of the symbolic. If we focus on R, I and S are contracted under the domination of S. Therein resides the shift in Lacan's work announced by his Seminar 7 on the ethics of psychoanalysis. The shift from the axis IS to the axis SR. Or in Freud's case, if we focus on the ego, its opposite is the id, which encompasses the superego, and so on and so forth. Logique des mondes enacts the shift from the axis being event to the axis world event. What this means is that being, world, and event do not form a triad. We have either the opposition of being and world, appearance, or the opposition of world and event. There is an unexpected conclusion to be drawn from this, insofar as, Badiou emphasizes the point again and again, a true event is not merely a negative gesture, but opens up a positive dimension of the new. An event is the imposition of a new world, of a new master signifier, a new naming, as Badiou puts it, or what Lacan called vers un nouveau signifiant. The true evental change is the passage from the old to the new world. One should even go a step further and introduce the dimension of dialectics here. An event can be accounted for by the tension between the multiplicity of being and the world. Its site is the symptomal torsion of a world. It is generated by the excess of being over world, of presence over representation. The properly Hegelian enigma is here not how is an event, the rise of something truly new, possible, but rather how do we pass from being to world, to finite appearance? That is, how can being, its flat infinite multiplicity, appear to itself? Is it not that this presupposes a kind of negativity that has to be somehow operative in the midst of being itself, some force of, not infinity, but on the contrary, finitization, what Hegel called the absolute power of tearing apart what in reality belongs together, of giving autonomy to appearance? Prior to any synthesis, spirit is what Kant called transcendental imagination, the power to abstract, to simplify, mortify, to reduce a thing to its unairy feature. Le train unair, der einzige Zug, to erase its empirical richness. Spirit is the power to say, when it is confronted with a confusing wealth of empirical features, all this doesn't really matter. Just tell me if the feature X is there or not. And insofar as world as such is sustained by a point, by such a violent imposition of a unairy feature, is a pointless atonal world, not a name for worldlessness. Badiou himself recently claimed that our time is devoid of worldliness, referring to Marx's well-known passage from the Communist Manifesto about the deterritorializing force of capitalism, which dissolves all fixed social forms. The passage where Marx speaks of the desacralization of all sacred bonds in the icy waters of capitalism has an enthusiastic tone. It is Marx's enthusiasm for the dissolving power of capital, the fact that capital revealed itself to be the material power capable of disencumbering us of the superego features of the one, and the sacred bonds that accompany it, effectively represents its positively progressive character, and it is something that continues to unfold to the present day. Having said that, the generalized atomism, the recurrent individualism, and finally the abasement of thought into mere practices of administration, of the government of things or of technical manipulation, could never satisfy me as a philosopher. I simply think that it is in the very element of desacralization that we must reconnect to the vocation of thinking. Badiou thus recognizes the exceptional ontological status of capitalism, whose dynamic undermines every stable framework of representation. The task that should normally be performed by critico-political activity, namely the task of undermining the representational frame of the state, is already performed by capitalism itself, and this poses a problem for Badiou's notion of evental politics. In pre-capitalist formations, every state, every representational totalization implies a foundational exclusion, a point of symptomal torsion, a part of no part, an element which, although part of the system, does not have a proper place within it, and emancipatory politics has to intervene from this excessive supernumerary element which, although part of the situation, cannot be accounted for in terms of the situation. However, what happens when the system no longer excludes the excess, but directly posits it as its driving force, as is the case in capitalism, which can only reproduce itself through its constant self-revolutionizing, through the constant overcoming of its own limits? To put it in a simplified way, if a political event, a revolutionary, emancipatory intervention into a determinate historical world, is always linked to the excessive point of its symptomal torsion, if it by definition undermines the contours of this world, how then are we to define the emancipatory political intervention into a universe which is already in itself worldless, which, for its reproduction, no longer needs to be contained by the constraints of a world? As Alberto Toscano noted in his perspicuous analysis, Badiou gets caught here in an inconsistency. He draws the logical conclusion that in a worldless universe, which is the contemporary universe of global capitalism, the aim of emancipatory politics should be the precise opposite of its traditional modus operandi. The task today is to form a new world, to propose new master signifiers that would provide cognitive mapping. Whilst in Badiou's theoretical writings on the appearance of worlds, he cogently argues that events engender the dysfunction of worlds and their transcendental regimes. In his Ontology of the Present, Badiou advocates the necessity, in our intervallic or worldless times, of constructing a world, such that those now excluded can come to invent new names, names capable of sustaining new truth procedures. As he writes, I hold that we are at a very special moment, a moment at which there is not any world. As a result, philosophy has no other legitimate aim except to help find the new names that will bring into existence the unknown world that is only waiting for us because we are waiting for it. In a peculiar inversion of some of the key traits of his doctrine, it seems that Badiou is here advocating, to some extent, an ordering task, one that will, inevitably, if perhaps mistakenly, resonate for some with the now ubiquitous slogan, "Another world is possible." This inconsistency brings us back to the topic of determinate negation. The ordering task of building a new world is a kind of return of the repressed, not only the repressed of Badiou's theory, but also the repressed of the political event itself, which serves Badiou as the main contemporary point of reference, and which, as we have seen, failed precisely in this task of ordering the Maoist cultural revolution. The lessons of the Cultural Revolution. What then, for Badiou, is the historical lesson, of the Cultural Revolution? It is difficult to miss the irony of the fact that Badiou, who adamantly opposes the notion of the act as negative, locates the historical significance of the Maoist Cultural Revolution precisely in signaling, quote, the end of the party state as the central production of revolutionary political activity. More generally, the Cultural Revolution showed that it was no longer possible to assign either the revolutionary mass actions or the organizational phenomena to the strict logic of class representation. That is why it remains a political episode of the highest importance. These lines are from Badiou's The Cultural Revolution, The Last Revolution, a text whose very title points towards an unexpected parallel with Heidegger. The Cultural Revolution holds for Badiou the same structural place as the Nazi Revolution did for Heidegger, that of the most radical political engagement, whose failure signals the end of, the traditional mode of, political engagement as such. The conclusion of Badiou's text emphatically reiterates this point. Quote, "In the end, the Cultural Revolution, even in its very impasse, bears witness to the impossibility, truly and globally, to free politics from the framework of the party-state that imprisons it. It marks an irreplaceable experience of saturation, because a violent will to find a new political path, to relaunch the revolution, and to find new forms of the workers' struggle under the formal conditions of socialism, ended up in failure when confronted with the necessary maintenance, for reasons of public order and the refusal of civil war, of the general frame of the party-state. The key importance of the last truly great revolutionary explosion of the 20th century is thus negative. It resides in its very failure, which signals the exhaustion of the party-statist logic of the revolutionary process. However, what if one should here take a step further and conceive both poles, presentation, direct extra-statist self-organization of the revolutionary masses, and representation, as two interdependent poles, so that, in a truly Hegelian paradox, the end of the party-state form of revolutionary activity, guided by the telos of taking over the state power, is simultaneously also the end of all forms of direct, non-representational, self-organization, workers' councils, and other forms of direct democracy. When, in his more recent Logique des mondes, Badiou makes the same point about the Cultural Revolution, his accent changes almost imperceptibly. Quote, "The Cultural Revolution in effect tested, for all of the world's revolutionaries, the limits of Leninism. It taught us that the politics of emancipation could no longer be subject to the paradigm of revolution or remain captive to the party form. Symmetrically, it cannot be inscribed in the parliamentary and electoral apparatus. Everything begins, and this is the somber genius of the Cultural Revolution, when, by saturating the previous hypotheses in the real, the high school Red Guards and students, and then the workers of Shanghai between 1966 and 1968, prescribed for the decades to come the affirmative realization of this beginning. But their fury was still so caught up in that against which they were rising up that they only explored this beginning from the standpoint of pure negation. There is a tension between these two interpretations. According to the Cultural Revolution, the last revolution, the failure of the Cultural Revolution bears witness to the impossibility, truly and globally, to free politics in the framework of the party-state that imprisoned it. And the cause of this failure is specified at a rather commonsensical level, the necessary maintenance, for reasons of public order and the refusal of civil war, of the general frame of the party-state. In short, the exigencies of the servicing of the goods. Whatever the revolutionary perturbations, life must go on, people have to work, to consume, and so on. And the only agency to do this was the party-state. In personal terms, no Mao Zedong without Zhu Enlai, making sure that the state functioned somehow during the turbulence of the Cultural Revolution. Contrary to this claim about the impossibility of freeing politics from the framework of the party-state, the passage from Logique des mondes perceives as the lesson of the Cultural Revolution lying in the impossibility of pursuing radical political activity within the framework of the party-state. The politics of emancipation could no longer be subject to the paradigm of revolution or remain captive to the party form. So neither can we practice revolutionary politics outside the party-state framework, nor can we do it within this framework. No wonder that when, in Logique des mondes, Badiou confronts the key question, is the eternal idea of egalitarian revolutionary politics with its four components, equality, terror, voluntarism, trust in the people, rooted in the statist party model, relying on a revolutionary state, which exhausted its potential in the Cultural Revolution, with the consequence that we have to abandon it? Or is it truly eternal and, as such, waiting to be reinvented in our post-revolutionary epoch? He offers an answer which is not convincing. In effect, What constitutes the trans-worldly subjectivity of the figure of the state revolutionary is precisely the fact that it tries to make the separation between state and revolutionary politics prevail, but with the twist that it tries to do so from within state power. Consequently, the figure in question only exists if we presuppose this separation. That is also why it is only philosophically constructible today, after a new thinking of politics has made it thinkable and practicable to situate oneself, in order to think action, from within a politics for which state power is neither an objective nor a norm. Badiou's resolution of this deadlock, neither within nor outside the state form, is thus, at a distance from the state form. Outside, but not an outside that is destructive of the state form, rather a gesture of subtracting oneself from the state form without destroying it. The true question here is, how is this externality with regard to the state to be operationalized? Since the Cultural Revolution signals the failure of the attempt to destroy the state from within, to abolish the state, is then the alternative to simply accept the state as a fact, as the apparatus that takes care of servicing the goods, and to operate at a distance towards it, bombarding it with prescriptive proclamations and demands? But does not such a position come close to that of Simon Critchley, who, as we have seen, argues that emancipatory politics is, quote, enacted or even simply acted, practically, locally, situationally, at a distance from the state. It calls the state into question. It calls the established order to account, not in order to do away with the state, desirable though that might well be in some utopian sense, but in order to better it or attenuate its malicious effect. The main ambiguity of this position resides in a strange non sequitur. If the state is here to stay, if it is impossible to abolish the state and capitalism, why act with the distance towards state? Why not act in the state? Why not accept the basic premise of the third way? In other words, is Critchley's and Badiou's position not that of relying on the fact that someone else will assume the task of running the state machinery, enabling us to engage in taking the critical distance towards it? Furthermore, if the space of emancipatory politics is defined by a distance towards the state, are we not abandoning the field of the state all too easily to the enemy? Is it not crucial what form state power takes? Does this position not lead to the reduction of this crucial question to a secondary status? Ultimately, it does not really matter what kind of state we have. So when Badiou claims that the Red Gardists prescribed for the decades to come the affirmative realization of this beginning, of which they themselves, since their fury remained caught up in what they were rising against, explored only the face of pure negation, will this affirmative realization be the one of inventing a new way of dispensing with the state, of abolishing it, or a mere distance towards the state, or, much more radically, a new appropriation of state apparatuses? There is, however, another even more important aspect of the failure of the Cultural Revolution. Badiou reads this failure, and more generally the demise of communism, as signaling the end of the epoch in which, in politics, it was possible to generate truth at the universal level, as a global, revolutionary project. Today, in the aftermath of this historical defeat, a political truth can only be generated as the fidelity to a local event, a local struggle, an intervention into a specific constellation. However, does he not thereby subscribe to his own version of postmodernism, of the notion that today only local acts of resistance are possible? What Badiou, like Laclau and Butler, seems to lack is a meta-theory of history that would provide a clear answer to the alternative that haunts postmodern theorizations of the political. Is the passage from large to small histories, from essentialism to contingency, from global to local politics, and so forth, itself a historical shift, so that prior to it, universal politics was possible? Or is the insight into the local character of political interventions an insight into the very essence of politics, so that the previous belief in the possibility of universal political intervention was an ideological illusion. Along these lines, Badiou recently relegated capitalism to the naturalized background of our historical constellation. Capitalism as worldless is not part of a specific situation. It is the all-encompassing background against which particular situations emerge. This is why it is senseless to pursue anti-capitalist politics. Politics is always an intervention into a particular situation against specific agents. One cannot directly fight the neutral background itself. One does not fight capitalism, one fights the US government, its decisions and measures, and so on. But does not this global background nonetheless let itself be felt, from time to time, as a very palpable and brutal limitation? The recurrent story of the contemporary left is that of a leader or party elected with universal enthusiasm, promising a new world, Mandela, Lula. But then, sooner or later, usually after a couple of years, they stumble upon the key dilemma. Does one dare touch the capitalist mechanisms, or does one decide to play the game? If one disturbs the mechanisms, one is very swiftly punished by market perturbations, economic chaos, and the rest. So although it is true that anti-capitalism cannot be directly the goal of political action, in politics one opposes concrete political agents and their actions, not an anonymous system. One should apply here the Lacanian distinction between goal and aim. If not the immediate goal of the emancipatory politics, anti-capitalism should be its ultimate aim, the horizon of all its activity. Is this not the lesson of Marx's notion of the critique of political economy, totally absent in Badiou? Although the sphere of the economy appears apolitical, it is the secret point of reference and structuring principle of political struggles. A few days before the Czech municipal and Senate elections on October 16, 2006, the Ministry of the Interior of the Czech Republic banned the organization the Communist Youth League, KSM. What was its criminal idea on account of which, according to the Ministry of the Interior, the KSM deserved to be banned? The fact that its program advocates the transformation of private property of the means of production into social property, thereby contradicting the Czech constitution. To claim that the demand for social ownership of the means of production is a crime is to say that modern left-wing thought has criminal roots. The act proper is precisely an intervention which does not merely operate within a given background, but disturbs its coordinates and thus renders it visible as a background. So, in contemporary politics, a sine qua non of an act is that it disturbs the background status of the economy by rendering palpable its political dimension, which is why Marx wrote on political economy. Recall Wendy Brown's trenchant observation that if Marxism had any analytical value for political theory, was it not in the insistence that the problem of freedom was contained in the social relations implicitly declared unpolitical, that is, naturalized, in liberal discourse? This is why the political purchase of contemporary American identity politics would seem to be achieved in part through a certain renaturalization of capitalism. The crucial question to be asked is thus, quote, to what extent a critique of capitalism is foreclosed by the current configuration of oppositional politics, and not simply by the loss of the socialist alternative or the ostensible triumph of liberalism in the global order. In contrast with the Marxist critique of a social whole and the Marxist vision of total transformation, to what extent do identity politics require a standard internal to existing society against which to pitch their claims? A standard that not only preserves capitalism from critique, but sustains the invisibility and inarticulateness of class, not incidentally, but endemically. Could we have stumbled upon one reason why class is invariably named but rarely theorized or developed in the multiculturalist mantra: race, class, gender, sexuality. Although Badiou's universalism is, of course, radically opposed to identity politics, does it not share with it this renaturalization of capitalism in the guise of the reduction of capitalism to an omnipresent background of political struggles? Furthermore, the irony here is that this renaturalization of capitalism into a presupposed background is the key ideological constituent of what Fukuyama called the end of history. The obvious choice apropos Fukuyama seems to be either one accepts his pseudo-Hegelian thesis on the end of history, on the finally found rational form of social life, or one emphasizes that struggles and historical contingency go on, that we are far from any end of history. My point is that neither of the two options is truly Hegelian. One should, of course, reject the naive notion of the end of history in the sense of achieved reconciliation, of the battle in principle already won. However, with today's global capitalist liberal democratic order, with this regime of global reflexivity, we did reach a qualitative break with all history hitherto. History did, in a way, reach its end. We do, in fact, live in post-historical society. Globalized historicism and contingency are definitive indexes of this end of history. So one can say that we should indeed assert that today, although history is not at an end, the very notion of historicity functions in a different way than before. What this means is that, paradoxically, the renaturalization of capitalism and the experience of our society as a reflexive risk society in which phenomena are experienced as contingent, as the result of a historically contingent construction, are two sides of the same coin. The predominant notion of ideology is that it fixates on or naturalizes what is in fact the contingent result of a historical process. The antidote is thus to see things as dynamic, part of a historical process. Today, however, when the notion of universal historicity and contingency is part of the hegemonic ideology, one should rather turn the critico-ideological perspective upside down and ask, what is it that remains the same in the much-celebrated nomadic dynamism of contemporary society? The answer is, of course, capitalism, capitalist relations. And the relationship between the same and what has changed is here properly dialectical. That which remains the same, capitalist relations, is the very constellation which instigates the incessant change, since the deepest feature of capitalism is its dynamic of permanent self-revolutionizing. Which subtraction? One should always be attentive when opponents start to talk the same language, to share a premise. This shared point is, as a rule, their symptomal point. Let us take three contemporary philosophers as different as Badiou, Critchley, and Negri. As we have seen, they shared the premise that the era of party-state politics, in which the ultimate aim is to take control of the state apparatus, is over. From now on, politics should subtract itself from the domain of the state, creating spaces outside, sites of resistance. The obverse of this shift is the acceptance of capitalism as the background of our lives. The lesson of the fall of communist states is that it is meaningless to fight capitalism. It is from this shared space that one should subtract oneself. Resistance presents itself as an exodus, as a departure outside the world. In a recent interview, Alain Badiou exposed the core of his political diagnosis of our predicament. He starts by drawing a line of distinction between communism and Marxism. He still considers himself a communist. Communism in the generic sense simply means that everyone is equal to everyone else within the multiplicity and diversity of social functions. Marxism, however, is something else. The core of Marxism is what Lenin called the ABC of communism. The masses are divided into classes, the classes are represented by parties, and the parties directed by leaders. This is what no longer holds today. The disorganized masses of global capitalism are no longer divided into classes in the classical Marxist fashion. So while the task still is to organize the masses politically, it can no longer be done in the old class party manner. The model of centralized party made possible a new form of power that was nothing less than the power of the party itself. We are now at what I call a distance from the state. This is first of all because the question of power is no longer immediate. Nowhere does a taking power in the insurrectional sense seem possible today. 3 points are to be noted here. First, the ambiguous definition of communism. Equality within the multiplicity and diversity of social functions. What this definition avoids is the inequality generated by the very multiplicity and diversity of social functions. Second, the notion of class antagonism as simply the masses divided into classes reduces it to a subdivision within the social body, ignoring its status as a cut that runs across the entire social body. Third, what is the exact status of the impossibility of a revolutionary seizure of power? Is this a mere temporary setback, a sign that we live in a non-revolutionary situation, or does it indicate the limitation of the party-state model of revolution? Badiou opts for the second version. In this new situation, we need a new form of politics, the politics of subtraction. Political processes that are independent of, subtracted from, the power of the state. Unlike the insurrectional form of the party, this politics of subtraction is no longer immediately destructive, antagonistic, or militarized. How are we to think this externality with regard to state? Badiou proposes here his key conceptual distinction, that between destruction and subtraction. A subtraction is no longer dependent on the dominant laws of the political reality of a situation. It is irreducible, however, to the destruction of these laws as well. A subtraction might leave the laws of the situation still being in place. What subtraction does is bring about a point of autonomy. It's a negation, but it cannot be identified with the properly destructive part of negation. We need an originary subtraction capable of creating a new space of independence and autonomy from the dominant laws of the situation. The underlying philosophical category that Badiou problematizes here is the Hegelian notion of determinate negation, of a negation, destruction, whose result is not zero. Contrary to Hegel, for whom the negation of the negation produces a new affirmation, I think we must assert that today negativity, properly speaking, does not create anything new. It destroys the old, of course, but does not give rise to a new creation. Crucial is this link between revolutionary politics and Hegelian dialectics. Just as the party, which was once the victorious form of insurrection, is today outdated, so too is the dialectical theory of negation. Unfortunately, this leads Badiou to a pseudo-problem of adjustment or calibration between the properly negative part of negation and the part I called subtractive. What I call a weak negation, the reduction of politics to democratic opposition, can be understood as a subtraction that has become so detached from destructive negation that it can no longer be distinguished from what Habermas calls consensus. On the other hand, we are also witnessing a desperate attempt to maintain destruction as a pure figure of creation and the new. This symptom often has a religious and nihilistic dimension. In short, the task is to find a proper measure between democratic pure subtraction, deprived of its destructive potential, and a purely destructive terrorist negation. The problem here is that this internal disjunction of negation into its destructive and subtractive aspects exactly reproduces the disjunction to which the Hegelian notion of determinate negation tried to provide a solution. Badiou is well aware that one should not renounce violence. One should rather reconceptualize it as defensive violence, a defense of the autonomous space created by subtraction, like the Zapatistas defending their liberated territory. The example of this proper measure provided by Badiou raises more questions than it answers. That of the Solidarity movement in Poland, which practiced a new dialectic between the means of actions that were classically understood to be negative, the strike, demonstrations, and so on, and something like the creation of a space of autonomy in the factories. The objective was not to take power, to replace an existing power, but to force the state to invent a new relation with the workers. However, the reason why this experiment was so brief, as Badiou himself notes, is that it clearly functioned as the second phase in the three phases of dissidence. 1. Criticizing the regime on its own terms. We want true socialism. That is, the reproach of the ruling party is, you betrayed your own socialist roots. 2. To the counter-approach of the ruling party that this adherence to socialism is hypocritical, follows the open admission. Yes, we are outside the scope of the ruling socialist ideology, but we do not want power, just our autonomy. Plus, our demand is that those in power respect certain elementary ethical rules, human rights, etc. 3. To the reproach of the ruling party that this lack of interest in taking power is hypocritical, that the dissidents really want power, follows the open admission. Yes, why not? We want power. Badiou's other example, that of Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its ambiguous relation to state power, participating in it while retaining a distance towards it, resuscitating something like the old Leninist notion of dual power, which was for Lenin also a temporary tactic, laying ground for the later full takeover, gives rise to a further problem: the religious foundation of these movements. Badiou makes the point that there is an internal limitation to these movements, bound as they are to religious particularity. Is, however, this limitation only a short-term one, as Badiou seems to imply, something that these movements will have to overcome in the proverbial second higher stage of their development, when they will have to universalize themselves? Badiou is right to note that the problem here is not religion as such, but its particularity. And is this particularity not now a fatal limitation of these movements, whose ideology takes a directly counter-Enlightenment form? The adequate reply to Badiou's version of Bartleby politics should be the Hegelian one. The whole problem of proper measure is a false one. Subtraction is the negation of negation, or determinate negation. In other words, instead of directly negating, destroying the ruling power, remaining within its field, it undermines this very field, opening up a new positive space. The point is that there are subtractions and subtractions. Badiou himself commits a symptomatic conceptual regression when he qualifies the social democratic position as a pure subtraction. The democratic subtraction is no subtraction at all. It is rather the nihilist terrorists who subtract, creating their space of fundamentalist religious identity. In them, radical destruction overlaps with radical subtraction. Another pure subtraction is New Age meditative withdrawal, which creates a space of its own while leaving the sphere of social reality the way it is. There is also pure destruction, the outbursts of meaningless violence like the burning of the cars in the French banlieue of 2005. So when is subtraction really creative of a new space? The only appropriate answer, when it undermines the coordinates of the very system from which it subtracts itself, striking at the point of its symptomal torsion. Imagine the proverbial house of cards or a pile of wooden pieces which rely on one another in such a complex way that if one single card or piece of wood is pulled out, subtracted, the whole edifice collapses. This is the true art of subtraction. Recall the plot of Saramago's Seeing, in which voters massively refused to vote and cast invalid ballots, throwing the entire political establishment, the ruling bloc and the opposition, into panic. This act put them in a situation of radical responsibility towards their subject. Such an act is subtraction at its purest, a mere gesture of withdrawing from participation in a legitimizing ritual makes state power appear as if suspended in the air above the precipice. Their acts no longer covered by democratic legitimization, those in power are all of a sudden deprived of the option of replying to the protesters, "Who are you to criticize us? We are an elected government, we can do what we want." Lacking legitimacy, they have to earn it the hard way, by their deeds. I remember the last years of communist rule in Slovenia. There was no government so eager to earn its legitimacy and do something for the people, trying to please everyone, precisely because the communists held power, which, as everyone, including themselves, knew, was not democratically legitimized. Since the communists knew that their end was approaching, they knew they would be harshly judged. There is an obvious reproach that arises here. Is this not the case already today, with the growing indifference and abstention of voters? Those in power feel no threat in these phenomena, so where is the subversive edge here? The answer is that one should focus on the big other. The majority of those who do not vote do it not as an active gesture of protest, but in the mode of relying on others. I do not vote, but I count on others to vote in my place. Non-voting becomes an act when it affects the big other. In this precise sense, subtraction already is the Hegelian negation of the negation. The first negation is a direct destruction. It violently negates, destroys the positive content that it opposes within the same shared field of reality. A subtraction proper, on the contrary, changes the coordinates of the field itself, within which the struggle is taking place. In some of Badiou's formulations, this crucial point gets lost. Peter Hallward has drawn attention to the multiplicity of meanings of Badiouian subtraction, as if this notion covers a Wittgensteinian family of meanings. The main axis is between subtraction as withdrawing from the domain of state, creating a space of one's own, and subtraction as reduction to minimal difference, moving from multiplicity to basic antagonism, and thus drawing the real line of separation. The difficult task is to make a move in which these two dimensions overlap. The subtraction to be made is one from the hegemonic field, which, simultaneously, forcefully intervenes into this field, reducing it to its occluded minimal difference. Such a subtraction is extremely violent, even more violent than destruction, purification. It is a reduction to minimal difference, to a difference of parts, no part, one and zero, groups, and the proletariat. It is not only a subtraction of the subject from the hegemonic field, but a subtraction which violently affects this field itself, laying bare its true coordinates. Such a subtraction does not add a third position to the two positions whose tension characterizes the hegemonic field, so that we have now, on the top of liberalism and fundamentalism, also radical leftist emancipatory politics. This third term rather denaturalizes the whole hegemonic field, bringing out the underlying complicity of the opposed poles that constitute it. Take Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The hegemonic opposition is there the one between Capulets and Montagues. It is the opposition in the positive order of being, a stupid issue of belonging to a particular this or that family clan. To make this issue into a minimal difference, to subordinate all other choices to this one as the only choice that really matters, is the wrong move. Romeo and Juliet's gesture with regard to this hegemonic opposition is precisely that of subtraction. Their love singularizes them. They subtract themselves from its hold, constituting their own space of love, which, the moment it is practiced as marriage, not merely as a transgressive secret affair, perturbs the hegemonic opposition. The crucial thing to take note of here is that such a subtractive gesture on behalf of love works only with regard to the substantive differences of particular ethnic, religious domains, not with regard to class differences. Class differences are non-subtractive. One cannot subtract from them because they are not differences between particular regions of social being, but cut across the entire social space. When confronted with a class difference, there are only two solutions to the love bond. Namely, the couple has to take sides. Either the lower class partner is graciously accepted into the higher class, or the higher class partner renounces his or her class in a political gesture of solidarity with the subaltern class. Therein resides the dilemma of subtraction. Is it a subtraction withdrawal, which leaves the field from which it withdraws intact, or even functions as its inherent supplement, like the subtraction from social reality to one's true self proposed by New Age meditation? Or does it violently shake up the field from which it withdraws? The first subtraction fits post-political biopolitics perfectly. What then would be the opposite of biopolitics? Give the dictatorship of the proletariat a chance? What if we take the risk of resuscitating the good old dictatorship of the proletariat as the only way to break with biopolitics? This cannot but sound ridiculous today. It cannot but appear that these are two incompatible terms from different fields with no shared space. The latest analysis of political power versus archaic and discredited communist mythology. And yet, this is the only true choice today. The term proletarian dictatorship continues to point towards the key problem. A commonsensical reproach arises here. Why dictatorship? Why not true democracy or simply the power of the proletariat? The term proletarian dictatorship continues to point towards the crucial issue. Dictatorship does not mean the opposite of democracy, but democracy's own underlying mode of functioning. From the very beginning, the thesis on the dictatorship of the proletariat involved the presupposition that it is the opposite of other forms of dictatorship, since the entire field of state power is that of dictatorship. When Lenin designated liberal democracy as a form of bourgeois dictatorship, he did not imply a simplistic notion that democracy is really manipulated, a mere facade, that some secret clique is really in power and controls things, and that, if threatened with losing its power in democratic elections, it will show its true face and assume direct power. What he meant is that the very form of the bourgeois democratic state, the sovereignty of its power in its ideological political presuppositions, embodies a bourgeois logic. One should thus use the term dictatorship in the precise sense in which democracy is also a form of dictatorship, that is, as a purely formal determination. It is often pointed out that self-questioning is constitutive of democracy, that democracy always allows, solicits even, constant self-interrogation of its features. However, this self-referentiality has to stop at some point. Even the most free elections cannot put in question the legal procedures that legitimize and organize them, the state apparatuses that guarantee, by force if necessary, the electoral process, and so on. The state, in its institutional aspect, is a massive presence which cannot be accounted for in terms of the representation of interests. The democratic illusion is that it can. Badiou has conceptualized this excess as the excess of state representation over what it represents. One can also put it in Benjaminian terms. While democracy can more or less eliminate constituted violence, it still has to rely continuously on constitutive violence. Let us recall the lesson of Hegelian concrete universality. Imagine a philosophical debate between a hermeneuticist, a deconstructionist, and an analytic philosopher. What they sooner or later discover is that they do not simply occupy positions within a shared common space called philosophy. What distinguishes them is the very notion of what philosophy is as such. That is, an analytic philosopher perceives the global field of philosophy and the respective differences between the participants differently than a hermeneuticist. What is different between them are the differences themselves, which are what render their true differences, in the first approach, invisible. The gradual classificatory logic of this is what we share and here our differences begin breaks down. For the contemporary cognitivist analytic philosopher, with the cognitivist turn, philosophy has finally reached the maturity of serious reasoning, leaving behind metaphysical speculation. For a hermeneuticist, analytic philosophy is, on the contrary, the end of philosophy, the final loss of a truly philosophical stance, the transformation of philosophy into another positive science. So when the participants in the debate are struck by this more fundamental gap that separates them, they stumble upon the moment of dictatorship. And, in a homologous fashion, the same goes for political democracy. Its dictatorial dimension becomes palpable when the struggle turns into the struggle about the field of struggle itself. So what about the proletariat? Insofar as the proletariat designates the part of no part, which stands for universality, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the power of universality, where those who are the part of no part set the tone. Why are they egalitarian universalists? Again, for purely formal reasons, because as the part of no part, they lack the particular features that would legitimate their place within the social body. They belong to the set of society without belonging to any of its subsets. As such, their belonging is directly universal. Here, the logic of the representation of multiple particular interests and their mediation through compromises reaches its limit. Every dictatorship breaks with this logic of representation, which is why the simplistic definition of fascism as the dictatorship of finance capital is wrong. Marx already recognized that Napoleon III, that proto-fascist, broke with the logic of representation. The term dictatorship designates the hegemonic role in the political space, and the term proletariat, those out of joint in the social space, the part of no part, lacking their proper place within it. This is why the all-too-quick dismissal of the proletariat as the universal class misses the point. The proletariat is not the universal class in the same sense in which, for Hegel, the state bureaucracy was the universal class, directly standing for the universal interests of society, in contrast to other estates which stand for their particular interests. What qualifies the proletariat for this position is ultimately a negative feature. All other classes are potentially capable of reaching the status of the ruling class, while the proletariat cannot achieve this without abolishing itself as a class. What makes the working class into an agency and provides it with a mission is neither its poverty, nor its militant and pseudo-military organization, nor its proximity to the chiefly industrial means of production. It is only its structural inability to organize itself into yet another ruling class that provides the working class with such a mission. The proletariat is the only revolutionary class in history that abolishes itself in the act of abolishing its opposite. The people, on the other hand, made up of a myriad of classes and subclasses, social and economic strata, cannot structurally carry out such a mission. Quite on the contrary, whenever a historical task is assigned to the people as such, the outcome has always been that either a fetal bourgeoisie immediately took precedence and, through an accelerated growth process, organized itself into a ruling class, as in the case of national liberation movements, or a politico-ideological nucleus designated itself as a caretaker government for an indeterminate period, for the people, or more specifically, the working class, which unerringly ended up in empire, as it was in the case of Jacobins and Bolsheviks. There is thus more than hypocrisy in the fact that, at the highest point of Stalinism, when the entire social edifice was shattered by purges, the new constitution proclaimed the end of the class character of Soviet power. Voting rights were restored to members of classes previously excluded, and that the socialist regimes were called people's democracies. The opposition of the proletariat and the people is crucial here. In Hegelese, their opposition is the very opposition of true and false universality. The people is inclusive, the proletariat is exclusive. The people fights intruders, parasites, those who obstruct its full self-assertion. The proletariat fights a struggle which divides the people in its very core. The people wants to assert itself, the proletariat wants to abolish itself. One should thus thoroughly demystify the scarecrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat. At its most basic, it stands for the tremulous moment when the complex web of representations is suspended due to the direct intrusion of universality into the political field. With regard to the French Revolution, it was, significantly, Danton, not Robespierre, who provided the most concise formula for the imperceptible shift from the dictatorship of the proletariat to statist violence, or, in Benjamin's terms, from divine to mythic violence. Let us be terrible, so that the people will not have to be. For Danton, Jacobin revolutionary state terror was a kind of preemptive action, whose true aim was not to take revenge on its enemies, but to prevent the direct divine violence of the sans-culottes, of the people themselves. In other words, let us do what the people demand us to do, so that they will not do it themselves. From ancient Greece, we have a name for this intrusion: democracy. That is to say, what is democracy at its most elementary? A phenomenon which, for the first time, appeared in ancient Greece, when the members of the demos, those with no firmly determined place in the hierarchical social structure, not only demanded that their voice be heard against those in power, they not only protested the wrong they suffered and wanted their voice to be recognized and included in the public sphere, on an equal footing with the ruling oligarchy and aristocracy. Even more, they, the excluded, presented themselves as the embodiment of the whole of society, of true universality. We, the nothing, not counted in the order, are the people. We are all against others who stand only for their particular privileged interest. Political conflict proper designates the tension between the structured social body, in which each part has its place, and the part of no part, which unsettles this order on account of the empty principle of universality, of what Etienne Balibar calls égalité, the principled equality of all men qua speaking beings, up to and including the liumang, hoodlums in the China of today, those who are displaced and float freely hither and thither, without work or home, but also without cultural or sexual identities, and unregistered by the state. This identification of the part of society with no properly defined place within it, or which rejects the allocated subordinated place within it, with the whole, is the elementary gesture of politicization, discernible in all great democratic events, from the French Revolution, in which le troisième état proclaimed itself identical with the nation as such, against the aristocracy and clergy, to the demise of East European socialism, in which dissident fora proclaimed themselves representative of the entirety of society against the party nomenclatura. In this precise sense, politics and democracy are synonymous. The basic aim of anti-democratic politics, always and by definition, is and was depoliticization. The demand that things should return to normal, with each individual sticking to his or her particular job. And this brings us to the inevitable paradoxical conclusion. The dictatorship of the proletariat is another name for the violence of the democratic explosion itself. The dictatorship of the proletariat is thus the zero level at which the difference between legitimate and illegitimate state power is suspended. In other words, when state power as such is illegitimate. Saint-Just said in November 1792, "Every king is a rebel and an usurper." This phrase is a cornerstone of emancipatory politics. There is no legitimate king as opposed to the usurper, since being a king is in itself an usurpation, in the same sense that, for Proudhon, property as such is theft. What we have here is the Hegelian negation of the negation, the passage from the simple and direct negation, this king is not legitimate, he is a usurper, to the inherent self-negation. An authentic king is an oxymoron. Being a king is usurpation. This is why, for Robespierre, the trial of the king was not a trial at all. There is no trial to be held here. Louis is not a defendant. You are not judges. You cannot be anything but statesmen and representatives of the nation. You have no sentence to pronounce for or against a man, but a measure of public salvation to implement, an act of national providence to perform. Louis was king, and the Republic is founded. The famous question you are considering is settled by those words alone. Louis was dethroned by his crimes. Louis denounced the French people as rebellious. To chastise it, he called on the arms of his fellow tyrants. Victory in the people decided that he was the rebellious one. Therefore, Louis cannot be judged. Either he is already condemned, or the Republic is not acquitted. Proposing to put Louis on trial, in whatever way that could be done, would be to regress towards royal and constitutional despotism. It is a counter-revolutionary idea, for it means putting the revolution itself in contention. In fact, if Louis can still be put on trial, then he can be acquitted. He may be innocent. What am I saying? He is presumed to be so until he has been tried. But if Louis is acquitted, if Louis can be presumed innocent, what becomes of the revolution? This strange coupling of democracy and dictatorship is grounded in the tension that pertains to the very notion of democracy. There are two elementary and irreducible sides to democracy: violent egalitarian imposition by those who are supernumerary, and the regulated, more or less, universal procedure of choosing those who will exert power. How do these two sides relate to each other? What if democracy, in the second sense, the regulated procedure of registering the people's voice, is ultimately a defense against itself, against democracy in the sense of the violent intrusion of the egalitarian logic that disturbs the hierarchical functioning of the social system, and attempt to re-functionalize this excess, to make it a part of the normal running of things. The problem is thus how to regulate, institutionalize the very violent egalitarian democratic impulse, how to prevent it from being drowned in democracy in the second sense of the term, regulated procedure. If there is no way to do it, then authentic democracy remains a momentary utopian outburst which, the proverbial morning after, has to be normalized. The Orwellian proposition, democracy is terror, is thus democracy's infinite judgment, its highest speculative identity. This dimension gets lost in Claude Lefort's notion of democracy as involving the empty place of power, the constitutive gap between the place of power and the contingent agents who, for a limited period, can occupy that place. Paradoxically, the underlying premise of democracy is thus not only that there is no political agent which has a natural right to power, but much more radically, that the people itself, the ultimate source of the sovereign power in democracy, does not exist in a substantial entity. In the Kantian conception, the democratic notion of the people is a negative concept, a concept whose function is merely to designate a certain limit. It prohibits any determinate agent from ruling with total sovereignty. The claim that the people does exist is the basic axiom of totalitarianism, and its mistake is strictly homologous to the Kantian misuse, paralogism, of political reason. The people exists through a determinate political agent, which acts as if it directly embodies, not only represents the people, its true will, the totalitarian party and its leader, that is, in the terms of transcendental critique, as a direct phenomenal embodiment of the noumenal people. Let us cite once again Jacques-Alain Miller's formulation of the link between this notion of democracy and Lacan's notion of the inconsistency of the big other. Is democracy a master signifier? Without any doubt. It is the master signifier which says that there is no master signifier, at least not a master signifier which would stand alone, that every master signifier has to insert itself wisely among others. Democracy is Lacan's big S of the Bard A, which says, I am the signifier of the fact that the other has a whole, or that it doesn't exist. Of course, Miller is aware that every master signifier bears witness to the fact that there is no master signifier, no other of the other, that there is a lack in the other, and so on. The very gap between S1 and S2 occurs because of this lack. As with God in Spinoza, the master signifier by definition fills in the gap in the series of ordinary signifiers. The difference is that with democracy, this lack is directly inscribed into the social structure. It is institutionalized in a set of procedures and regulations. No wonder, then, that Miller approvingly quotes Marcel Gauchet regarding how, in democracy, truth only offers itself in division and decomposition. And one cannot but note with irony how Stalin and Mao made the same claim, although with a totalitarian twist. In politics, truth only emerges through the ruthless divisions of the class struggle. It is easy to note how, from within this Kantian horizon of democracy, the terroristic aspect of democracy can only appear as its totalitarian distortion. In other words, how, within this horizon, the line that separates the authentic democratic explosion of revolutionary terror from the totalitarian party-state regime, or to put it in reactionary terms, the line that separates the mob rule of the dispossessed from the party-state's brutal oppression of the mob, is obliterated. It is against this background that one can formulate a critique of Jacques Rancière's political aesthetics, of his idea of the aesthetic dimension of the properly political act. A democratic explosion reconfigures the established hierarchical police order of social space. It stages a spectacle of a different order, of a different partage of the public space. Peter Hallward is right to point out that, in today's society of the spectacle, such an aesthetic reconfiguration has lost its subversive dimension. It can easily be appropriated into the existing order. The true task lies not in momentary democratic explosions which undermine the established police order, but in the dimension designated by Badiou as that of fidelity to the event, inscribing the democratic explosion into the positive police order, imposing on social reality a new, lasting order. This is the properly terroristic dimension of every authentic democratic explosion, the brutal imposition of a new order. And this is why, while everybody loves democratic rebellions, the spectacular, carnivalesque explosions of the popular will, anxiety arises when this will wants to persist, to institutionalize itself. And the more authentic the rebellion, the more terroristic is this institutionalization. The standard liberal counterargument to those who warn about the invisible hand of the market that controls our destinies is, if the price of being freed from the invisible hand of the market is to be controlled by the visible hand of new rulers, are we still ready to pay it? The answer should be yes. If this visible hand is visible to and controlled by the part of no part.